People have been telling you for years to learn vocab for the SAT, learn roots of words, even learn Latin. But the digital SAT isn't a vocab-heavy exam in the way that other standardized tests are. Studying long lists of random words is actually a very poor use of your time. That said, there is a short list of words that you can count on to appear on the digital SAT. Transitions. Transitions make up 80 of the 800 points on the digital SAT reading and writing test. The test makers love transitions because you don't use enough of them, and because transitions make great reasoning questions. So how do you study for these questions? That is the topic of today's video. My name's John. I'm a perfect scorer on the SAT writing section, two-time Ivy League grad, and one of America's highest rated tutors. This series is devoted to helping you master the digital SAT. Let's dive into the digital SAT to get a sense of what these transition questions are about. Pause the video and try this one. Etched into Peru's Nazca Desert are line drawings so large that they can only be fully seen from high above. Archaeologists have known of the lines since the 1920s when researchers spotted some from a nearby foothill, and they have been studying the markings ever since. Blank, archaeologists' efforts are aided by drones that capture high-resolution aerial photographs of the lines. Notice that the previous sentence is set 100 years ago, whereas the sentence with the blanks talks about modern technologies. That suggests a temporal relationship between the current sentence and what came before it. So the answer must be A. Half the game with these types of problems is understanding the relationship between the current sentence and the sentence before it. And it turns out there aren't that many ways that two sentences can relate to each other. The first category is a temporal relationship, and there are a handful of transitions that indicate this type of relationship. Currently, finally, meanwhile, next, previously, second, and subsequently. The other half of the game is knowing the words. So throughout this video, we're going to build up a top 40 word bank of the most common transitions appearing on the materials released by the College Board. We have our first 7. Now, if you happen to have taken the time to read the official study guide, which I don't recommend you do, you might point out that the College Board actually provides its own transition word bank. But this list only contains 34 transitions, 11 of which never actually appear as answer options on College Board materials, and then there are dozens of other transitions not on their list that appear multiple times in their exams. So we're going to focus on the transitions that actually get used. I also want to shine a spotlight on some transition words that you're probably not familiar with. The first is still. It's a common word, but I'm willing to bet that you've never used it as a transition. And even if you have, you probably don't recognize it as interchangeable with however. But they're both used to highlight a contrast between expectations and reality. Consider an example. It was raining heavily. Still, she decided to go for a run. Notice that in problem 28, still and however are so close in meaning that both must be wrong. These two, along with in comparison, belong to the family of contrasting transitions. This is our next category. By contrast, by comparison, conversely, however, nevertheless, on the contrary, on the other hand, regardless, still, and that said. There has never been a question on the SAT in which one of these transitions was correct and another word on the list was the wrong answer. That'll be the defining characteristic of all the categories of the transitions that follow. Let's also add a few more troublesome words to our diagram. Notice that nevertheless and regardless also work in our example sentence. It was raining heavily, nevertheless she decided to go for a run, and it was raining heavily, regardless she decided to go for a run. These are both used to show contrast between the current sentence and the previous one. Let's look at another example from the test. Pause the video to give this a try. According to Duverger's law, countries with single-ballot majoritarian elections for single-member districts tend to polarize into two-party systems, wherein dueling political parties consistently dominate the political system. Blank, countries with proportional representation electoral systems tend to support multipartyism, under which power gets distributed among many political parties. There isn't a time-based relationship between the current and previous sentences, so it's not subsequently. Now, let's talk about conversely. This is another word I want to spotlight. If you happen to know what the word converse means, don't worry about it. That will only confuse you. The transition conversely doesn't require the strict logical relationship that converse does in math or formal logic. Conversely is simply used to introduce a sentence that contrasts with a previous statement, which is exactly the relationship we have in this problem. So conversely is correct. We have a few other categories of transitions here, so let's toss those into our top 40 list. For example, for instance, and specifically are all used to elaborate on a point. In other words, is used for paraphrasing and it gets its own category. Let's try another one. Pause the video to look over it on your own. The more diverse and wide-ranging an animal's behaviors, the larger and more energy demanding the animal's brain tends to be. Blank, from an evolutionary perspective, animals that perform only basic actions should allocate fewer resources to growing and maintaining brain tissue. The specialized subtypes of ants within colonies provide an opportunity to explore this hypothesis. On transition problems, the question you want to ask yourself is, what is the relationship between the current and previous sentence? They don't occur at different times, so subsequently doesn't fit. We haven't talked about besides yet, but we should. Besides is used to introduce an additional point or reason. For example, I don't feel like watching a movie tonight. Besides, I need to study for the SAT. This word belongs to a larger family of words that's used to provide similar content to what's already been said. Additionally, furthermore, and moreover also accomplish the same function. Now, shifting back to problem 30, we're not introducing an additional point, so besides is out. There's also no sense of contrast. After reading the first sentence, we would expect animals that don't do much to have small brains. As a matter of fact, the second sentence logically follows from the first sentence, so we need thus. Also take a moment to appreciate that there are at least 6 other transition words that could have fit perfectly in this blank. One you may not be familiar with is accordingly, but this transition also means the current sentence is the consequence of what came before it. The weather forecast predicted heavy rain. Accordingly, the organizers moved the event indoors. That fills out my list of spotlighted words, but we still have a few categories of transitions left to mention. So let's try one last problem. Pause the video and try it on your own. Did you notice that by contrast and nevertheless are synonyms? Consequently, both must be wrong. Let's start from the top though. Biographer Michael Gora notes that the novelist Henry James lived in a world of second thoughts, frequently tinkering with his novels and stories after their initial publication. However, the differences between the 1881 first edition and the 1908 edition of his novel A Portrait of a Lady are extreme, even by James's standards. Blank, some critics regard the 2 editions as 2 different novels altogether. This one is a bit tricky. Is the author paraphrasing what came before the semicolon? No. So in other words is out. The author is providing more information to emphasize a point that's already been made, so in fact is what we need. Had it been offered as an answer choice instead, indeed would have worked here too. And speaking of instead, if you want to offer an alternative, use instead or alternatively. If you want to note a similarity, use likewise or similarly. Finally, in summary and in conclusion are ways to wrap things up. It's interesting to note, though, that while these frequently occur as options in transition questions, neither has ever been the correct answer on College Board material. This might be the test maker subtly sending you a signal that in conclusion and in summary are not emblematic of good writing. So, in conclusion, don't use in conclusion in your writing. You're better than that. That completes our list of the top 40 transitions, but if you are the sort of person who thinks, I don't just want the top 40 transitions, I need them all, here you go. Now you have every transition ever offered as an answer choice on College Board SAT exams or study materials over the past 8 years. Here are our takeaways for today. First, recognize categories of transitions, and second, familiarize yourself with the top 40 transitions. With that, it's time for us to transition to our next topic, so be sure to subscribe and check out my other content on the Digital SAT.